All right, so MVC, what's all the fuss? Bit about me, my name's Eric. I'm a solution architect at SSW. I like application architecture, do SQL performance tuning. I'm a certified Scrum Master. Basically work with all sorts of technology on the Microsoft stack. So I've done Silverlight, Windows Forms. The majority of my work is on ASP.NET plus MVC. Also dabble in CRM and business intelligence side of things as well. So a bit of a jack of all trades. So the agenda for today is we're just going to quickly go through the actual web stack from Microsoft. So from ASP Classic to Web Forms to the newest MVC. We're also going to have a look at why clients and devs are starting to adopt MVC. We'll have a look at some of the more common questions when people start using MVC. So like what third-party tool support is out there, what's the sort of learning curve in getting skilled in MVC, and basically a migration from ASP Web Forms onto MVC. After that, we've got an awesome offer, so if you guys can stick around and I'll explain what that offer is, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So I'll explain the Q&A session once we get to that and how that will work. Okay, so that's the agenda, that's a bit about me, so I'm just going to quickly run a poll just to find out a bit about yourselves. So if you could just answer that poll, I'll give you guys maybe a minute or so. Basically just wanting to find out whether you're a developer, project manager, or just someone who randomly stumbled upon this webinar. So I can see that we've got a few innocent bystanders who are sort of lost, but the majority of you guys seem to be developers, so great. So let me just close that. Just quickly show you guys the results as well. So the majority of you out there are developers, which is excellent. And just one more poll as well is just what technologies you currently use, whether it be in your companies or just personally at home on some side projects that you've got running. So Windows Forms, Web Forms, MVC, Silverlight, or if you're one of the unlucky few, Classic ASP. All right, so just some initial poll results. Looks like we have a far majority, 75% of you looking at Web Forms. About half of you have dabbled in MVC. A poor 11% unfortunately are stuck on Classic ASP. So I'll quickly just share the results of that poll. So it looks like a fair few of you still do Windows Forms, which is quite surprising. The majority of the work that we do here is mostly on the web. So, all right, so let's hide that. And let's get onto it. Okay. So let's take a quick tour of Classic ASP and what that offered. So it was basically VB scripting for the web. So you have all those problems of having spaghetti code. So anyone who's looked at ASP.NET would know that coding it was a nightmare. You've got ActiveX and COM hell. So whenever you need to do any sort of work, like more fancy things in ASP, you had to resort to an ActiveX control or a COM component. And having updates to these things is really troublesome because when you update COM, basically you have to stop IIS, update your COM object, restart IIS, make sure your app's still running. Okay, and here's just a quick look at some ASP code. So good old response.write, spit out some HTML. And we've got some logic here, and you'll notice that that's in VB. So problems with ASP Classic, so it's interpreted. So basically you don't find out about your errors till you get to runtime. And the whole process of developing ASP apps is you basically edit your project file, you save it, you load a page, and rinse and repeat to basically develop your app. The logic and the UI were basically on a single page. If you wanted to have some sort of object-oriented approach to this, you can sort of move the logic into COM objects, but then you have to manage those COM objects. Okay, it had poor performance, and it was basically poor architecture design. Then came ASP.NET. So at SSW, we basically migrated our old website onto ASP.NET, so we've lived through that sort of process. So ASP.NET brought a lot to the table. It basically is Windows Form for the web. It gave you this separation of HTML code, server-side code, you know, the ASPX file, the code behind file, the .cs or .vb, and the designer file. So it gave you that sort of separation. Okay, it's compiled and it's strongly typed, so you do get compile time errors, which is fantastic. You get overall better performance because it's actually compiled and not interpreted. You've got the Xcopy deployment, so you can just compile it, copy the bin files over to IIS. You usually don't need to do an IIS reset or anything like that. Okay, better performance overall because of that. And it brought along C# support. So back in ASP, it was VB scripting, so ASP.NET brought along C# support, which we're basically seeing almost everyone nowadays opting to code in C#. We do have the odd cases here and there that are still using VB.NET for a lot of their project work. Okay, and then ASP.NET also brought along a whole bunch of new features. So it gave you the event-driven model, brought along caching, server-side controls, data binding, which I guess for Windows Forms designers is great, so that you could just click on a couple of things, bind them up, and you've got a form ready to show on the web. It brought along web services as well, which is quite big. Pretty much every platform out there nowadays has some sort of web service API that you talk to. Okay, then we've got state management. So that was brought about by Microsoft trying to bring Windows Forms to the web. So Windows Forms knows about state. Inherently, the web is a stateless system, so ASP.NET tried to bring state management with you. So to do that, there was this view state object in the background. I'll talk a bit more about the view state in a second, but the other big benefit of ASP.NET was you got these drag and drop controls. So you have the designer, you've got your text box, drag the control onto your designer. Drag a grid on, you can choose what data binding to pick. As you can see here, you can just enable paging, enable sorting, things like that. So it made coding up web applications very easy. Now, one thing that I should mention is predominantly when most of the guys here at SSW do web development, they're usually stuck in the source view rather than the design view. And that's more of a trend that we see because sometimes the designer can be a bit buggy. When you switch from source to designer, sometimes it changes the HTML in the background. So problems with ASP.NET Web Forms. So I mentioned the view state for it to manage, I guess, state when you move from page to page. Biggest problem here is that by default, it just puts everything onto the view state. So you end up with problems with your web application scaling, having poor performance because of that view state. So you also had this false sense of separation from UI and code, and here's a quick example of a view state. It's basically a hidden input field with just, it's encoded, and on some pages that can be really, really massive. So every time the page gets rendered back, it needs to load up this massive view state as well, and also sometimes when you post back, you need to send this big view state back to the server. Okay, it's difficult to write unit tests against your web project, simply because that's just the model of ASP.NET. You're also limited in control of the HTML output. So if you use these third-party controls or built-in web controls, you don't really have control over how it's rendered. So if you drag on a grid view, for example, that's just rendered out as a table by default. You can customize it slightly if you use the newer list view controls, so you can make it render out as divs or something like that. But it's limited to what the controls actually offer you. Okay, URLs. So by default, URLs, you get that .aspx extension. And if you have a look at some of the other applications that Microsoft have written, like SharePoint, you will notice that it has absolutely horrible URLs, especially when you're like navigating to subpages or like a document in that application. As I mentioned before, the designer was slightly dodgy in that it modified your HTML whenever you switch to it, and sometimes it doesn't render out properly as well, particularly if you're using third-party controls. Okay, and once you do hit problems, you need to have an in-depth knowledge of the ASP.NET page life cycle. So quick show of the actual page life cycle. There's all these events and steps that you can actually hook into. I guess the most obvious one is this load event over here. So on form load, that's where we put most of our code, but sometimes we actually need to go back and put some code into the onInit method, particularly if you're doing some data binding or some AJAX type code. If you're writing custom controls, then you need to know about loading control state, loading view state, things like that. And that's not the end of the lifecycle. There's a whole another page to it. So you basically needed to know all these steps once you're hitting some problems with ASP.NET. Now with MVC tries to solve a lot of these problems. So you get a good separation, you get an actual separation of view and code out of the box. And I put this as a point because in ASP.NET, it's sort of a fake abstraction that you get. So for example, if you drag a button onto your ASP.NET web form, you double click it, it creates an event handler on your code behind, and then you do something with that event. But what you're doing is you have to read from different things on the web form. So you actually need to know about the UI state in that code behind file. So it's not really separated. It's actually tightly bound to that HTML view. But with MVC, it's actually very well separated. You've got a model that houses your data. You've got a view that will control how things are displayed. And then you've got a controller to basically join the two together. Okay, you've got a much shorter pipeline or lifecycle, and we'll see that in the next slide. It's fully unit testable, and that's just the way the controllers work because everything is an action that just takes in parameters. Okay, you have pretty much full control over the HTML output. And this is sort of a plus and downside, which I'll talk about later. You get pretty good URLs out of the box, and it's very easy to customize. And actually, you can use the MVC URL routing modules in your old ASP.NET Web Forms applications. I'll show you some of these URLs in a second as well. There's a much smaller footprint with ASP.NET MVC apps, and I'll show you this as well. The pages are a lot lighter. There's not a lot of crap when you do a view source, for example, like this view state. Okay, there's a built-in web API in MVC4, which will allow you to quickly build up a RESTful API for people to talk to your web applications. We've got good JSON support. It brings NuGet to the forefront. Basically, everything in MVC is a NuGet package. You can also use NuGet on your ASP.NET Web Forms, but you have to sort of opt in to use it, whereas with MVC, pretty much all the packages that it uses, like jQuery, things like that, are NuGet packages. And so you can quite easily keep your application up to date with new versions of jQuery. There's built-in mobile targeting in MVC4, so you can create views for iPhones, Windows phones, iPads, or new Windows tablets that will be coming out. Okay, there's built-in bundling and minification. So essentially, they've given a lot of thought to how the web has evolved and the things that are important now. So performance is a big thing, and a lot of these things address the performance issues. So mobile targeting, bundling and minification, having JSON support, friendly URLs and small footprint. Okay, and it's fully extensible, so you can pretty much extend everything from MVC. You don't like the Razor View engine, you can use another one, or you can write your own. There's like a Haml and Web Forms view models that you can use. Also, if you don't like the URL routing, you can write your own little module and plug it in there. And yeah, as Mike says in the chat, jQuery is basically built in. It's a built-in package whenever you create an MVC application. Okay, and the other thing is to save on a lot of work in the backend, it uses convention over configuration. And I'll talk about that when I talk about the learning curve into learning MVC. Okay, so problems with MVC. Initial cost of generating your first page. You have to have a lot set up. first before you get your first page out. So you have to have like your data models set up. You've got to create a view, a controller, if you need to customize any of the editor templates and things like that. So there's a larger cost of getting the initial app set up correctly. But once you do, it makes for easier development, and it makes for good unit testing as well, because the architecture is right from the start. Okay, there's lots of conventions that you need to learn. So I'll talk about those later on. When you're doing MVC development, your fingers get a good bit of exercise. It's actually quite a lot more typing that you need to do when compared to ASP.NET Web Forms, simply because you have that fine-grained control over the HTML output. You end up actually coding a lot more in HTML. Okay, there's actually no designer for MVC, so you're pretty much stuck with that HTML view. Okay, which might be a bit of a problem from people sort of migrating from like a Windows Forms environment. Okay, here's a quick snapshot of the MVC lifecycle. We go from a request to the routing modules. Okay, so how a URL is rendered back into a controller. And then the controller tells you which view to use, or which view engine and then which view to use, and then you spit out the HTML response. So pretty much for most of the development work, you're just looking at these last few, from the controller to the view engine to the view. That's pretty much all you're worried about. You can dabble in the HTTP routing and do like custom URLs if you want to have nice URLs, but the majority of your work just is in these last 4 bubbles. So it's a lot easier to understand once you do get into it. Okay, so here is some MVC code. So here we're just generating a grid, essentially. So we've got the table header, some rows, and then we're just generating a row from our data model. So I guess for those of you familiar with ASP.NET, this does look a lot, sorry, ASP Classic, this does look a lot like ASP. In that we've got these inline sort of variables with our HTML. So a lot of the time when we're working with a developer who's new to MVC, they pretty much ask, isn't this just ASP Classic that we're going back to? Don't we get all those problems from ASP Classic? So going back to it and addressing why it's not the case, you can see here we're doing away with a lot of that response.write stuff. It is, you actually get design time or coding time validation. So whenever you make a typo, you do get those error messages when you try to build. You get full sort of HTML designer support in terms of closing tags, opening tags, things like that. You get full IntelliSense as well, which is excellent. Okay, and then you've got these helper models as well. So you can see here where I've got the first TD tag, I've got HTML display for. I'm not actually telling it how to render out this distributor. There's these built-in display templates, which I'll quickly mention later on, that will control how these are rendered out. And there's also editor templates as well that will basically say, if this is a string, it'll just render out as a text box. If it's a Boolean property, it'll render out as a couple of radio buttons. If it's a date field, it'll be a date time picker. So it sort of does all of that logic for you. The other nice features you have are nice URLs. So like I mentioned, SharePoint, when I give a URL to a colleague, to a document library that I want to share with him, yeah, it's massively ugly URL with GUIDs and some names in here. So pretty ugly. Now with MVC, you get these nice URLs out of the box. So we've got our own internal timesheeting application called TimePro. So when I go to fill in my timesheets for the week, it's basically timepro/timesheets/EP, that's my initials, and that'll just render out my timesheets for the week. I've got a weekly calendar view as well, /week. We've got another URL to add a new timesheet, and you can pretty much tell from that URL it's for that date, the 29th of May, 2012. Okay, we've got this nice settings tab under a different section called accounts. Okay, and then we've got a reporting section as well. Okay, with missing timesheets for that day or for that week. So the nice URLs you get out of the box, and it's done from the conventions of MVC. So you write a controller. So in this case, I've got a timesheet controller. So that first segment in the URL is the controller. And then we've got a view behind it that we need to do. So I've got, for example, this account, I've got an account controller, and then I've got a settings view that I render out. Okay. So it's these conventions that you need to be aware of when you're coding MVC. Okay, view state is a big one. So here's an example website. So this is the Australia Day Council. It's a very simple form. Just want to subscribe to their newsletter, fill in 4 fields, my first name, last name, the state, and an email address. I click sign up. So this is actually using Umbraco, which is using ASP.NET Web Forms. When I post back to the server, you get this massive, massive, massive view state. So pretty much 90% of that is all junk. I don't need to worry about it. It's 800 kilobytes of just junk in the view state that I don't need. The relevant data is down the bottom. Those 4 fields, my first name, last name, the state that I picked, and my email address. Okay, with MVC, you don't actually get any of that view state. So for example, this is a screen where I add my timesheet, and there's actually quite a lot of fields that I need to fill in here. So here I've just filled it in. We've got my date, we've got the client that I'm working on this particular day. I'm actually taking some sick leave, recovering from the flu actually. So there's quite a few fields that I need to fill in. And then on the back end, you don't have that view state, and it's just sending back to the server the fields that matter, the fields that are actually filled in. And we can see here that it's actually only 400 bytes of data that I'm sending back to the server rather than that 8 kilobytes. So out of the box, it's like 1,000 times faster, which is great. Working with developers who have worked on MVC, besides the initial sort of impressions that, hey, isn't this just ASP Classic? Once they get into it, they find it to be a very good experience. So just some feedback. Lionel Pack says, another 12 months with web forms and we've pretty much gone crazy. Andrew says, MVC scaffolding with Entity Framework is blissful programming. We've got, I forgot who this was, but first impressions of working with MVC. Basically, it's great. You get the good architecture out of the box, which is excellent. And basically you're doing away with a lot of the craft of ASP.NET Web Forms. Okay, just some quick statistics as well, if you're not convinced already. So builtwith.com is basically a website that tracks technologies that different websites or projects are being built with. So ASP.NET, here's the trend. Unfortunately, it's sort of downward, sort of stable trend. Okay. When you compare that with MVC, MVC is on an upward trend. Okay, so you're sort of seeing some of that ASP.NET Web Forms projects being converted into MVC projects. That's why you're seeing this upward trend. And I should mention as well, MVC is now up to version 4, so it's not a brand new technology. It is 4 versions old, and at this point it is actually quite mature. Another statistic here for jobs. So ASP jobs are pretty much flatlining at the moment, and you can see here just at the very end we're seeing a bit of a dip in January 2012. If we go to MVC, that's just on its way up. So MVC is definitely something that you want to learn just for future job proofing. Make sure you're in a job in 12 months' time. But there will always be ASP.NET jobs out there. There are a lot of legacy systems that we need to support. Okay, so the adoption's quite good. At SSW, pretty much all of our greenfield projects are done in MVC. And the only exceptions are if we're working with a framework or a CMS system. So if the client's chosen to, say, use .NET Nuke or Umbraco or Kentaco, then we just have to stick with that. But if it's a completely greenfield where we've got control of everything, we're just writing it from scratch, we'd recommend MVC all the way. Okay, and as I said before, developers generally fall in love with MVC once they start using it. And pretty much you can see from those graphs from before, we're pretty much on the cusp of a sea change. We're seeing more and more MVC projects getting started rather than web forms projects. Okay, just a quick rattling off the other features of MVC. Web APIs I talked about, so you get RESTful services, very little effort. The URL routing, you can get that in web forms. You've got these filters which allow you to easily add in like error handling and log into all your actions. You've got content bundling, so that's all the minification and combining of JavaScript, CSS, so that your web applications are very light. You get NuGet built in. So NuGet is a great little tool for keeping all your packages up to date, and you can pretty much look for a package on NuGet to do a job. Okay, you get mobile targeting. It's open source, so if you find a bug in MVC, you can fix it. You can send a pull request to Microsoft and they'll integrate it. A lot of the new development happening in terms of tooling or performance type things are happening around MVC, and then they're getting ported back to web forms. So some of these examples in terms of NuGet packages like Glimpse, the view engines, the mini profiler, things like that, they originally started off as MVC only packages, and then they got ported back to web forms. So you'll see a lot more new things being MVC first before they get ported back to web forms rather than the other way around. Simply because developers are more interested in MVC, so they'll use those for their little pet projects. And then once those pet projects gain popularity, then they want to support a wider audience. So definitely if you want to be on the bleeding edge, MVC is good. Quick, I guess, snapshot of what these packages do as well. Glimpse is sort of like a Firebug for MVC. You can actually view parameters that get passed in on your website, and I'll show you this in a second. The mobile view engines are built in with MVC 4, but you can use that to create these mobile views just to target iPhones, Android phones, Windows phones. Mini Profiler is like SQL Profiler that you can just whack on your websites. So every time you refresh your page, you get these statistics to say how fast your page is rendered. MVC Mailer is a little package that allows you to easily send out emails via SMTP client. So that just puts in some default actions in a controller, and you just need to just call it. We've also got this new donut caching. So you've got your traditional caching where you can either cache the whole page or cache elements on a page and specify the different timeouts and things like that. Donut caching is a new concept. I think Phil Hack originally sort of worked on this and coined the concept. But essentially donut caching is cache everything by default, and I'll choose what not to cache. So if you picture a donut, you're basically specifying the holes that you don't want to cache. Okay, so a quick snapshot on what Glimpse is. So Glimpse is this little tool that basically gives you a snapshot of what's happening when you render out a page. So it sits in any browser, and it just works like Firebug if you're familiar with Firefox, the debugging tools. And in this case, we can see here when I rendered out this timesheet view, I can see on this bottom right here the different models that I'm using, the different data that I'm passing in. Okay, and then you've got other tabs as well to do like a full trace that you get with ASP.NET Web Form. You get a timeline view, you get server variables, you can see what routes that it matched in terms of the URL. You can get some metadata, you can get environment variables, things like that. So it's like a very useful tool to sort of do debugging on a live site. Okay, and with NuGet, all you need to do is just pretty much get the NuGet package, say I want to install Glimpse on my MVC app, install it on NuGet. You probably need to do 1 or 2 lines of configuration, and you've got that functionality. So NuGet's really good for this sort of stuff, where you just get the package, do 1 or 2 lines of config changes, and you're up and running. There's a couple of good packages as well, like Elma for doing error logging and things like that. All right, so yes, Glimpse is a free package. Most of the packages on NuGet are free. So common questions that I typically get asked when either companies or clients are starting with MVC or looking into a project on MVC. So the biggest question is third-party controls. Because like I mentioned before, MVC, you pretty much get that HTML design view and you're coding up a lot of things yourself. When MVC first came out, there wasn't actually a lot of support out there for these controls. You had to actually write it yourself. So with MVC 1 and 2, there wasn't many third-party controls. And even now with MVC 3 and 4, there's still not that many companies that actually have third-party controls. So you can sort of see in the diagram here, MVC third-party controls is sort of like that black jelly bean in the middle. ASP web forms is everything else. There's like millions of third-party controls for web forms. But we're seeing more and more companies develop MVC plugins. So the big names are Telerik. Telerik have MVC suite. You've got the MVC toolkit on Codeplex. So originally in MVC 1 and 2, people relied on the toolkit for some of their controls. Infragistics, another big name in the .NET tooling space. Component Art, Component 1 have one. DevExpress, I don't think, have an MVC control yet. But if you don't want to use one of these packages, there's also JavaScript-based solutions. So you can rely on jQuery and jQuery UI, which is bundled in by default. So jQuery UI has like your date pickers and different sliders, things like that you can use. You've got Kendo UI, again, another Telerik product that you can use. There's also Knockout.js and Twitter Bootstrap as well. So Mike says SyncFusion has some good third-party controls. I haven't checked them out, so I'll check them out after this. Always looking out for good third-party controls. All right, so other common questions that we've got is migrating from ASP.NET. So you've got an existing ASP.NET application. Should you move it to MVC? Or how hard is it to move to MVC? Well, the good thing about MVC is you can actually run it side by side. So you can have new development done in MVC while keeping your old ASP.NET web form, and that sits in the one project or one solution, which is fantastic. So usually the general recommendation is, hey, have all your new functionality done in MVC. That way your developers are learning about MVC while developing these new features, and you can still support the old pages with web forms. And then whenever you need to go back and update any of the existing functionality, try and convert all of that to MVC. So at some point, many iterations down the track, you'll have most of your application converted to MVC. So it's not this big bang where you have to convert everything over to MVC. You can run it in parallel, which is the great thing about MVC. Okay, the next big question that we always get asked is this learning curve. So how long will it take for me to get skilled in MVC, to be proficient in MVC? And what I'd like to say about that is you pretty much need to get thrown into the deep end. You need to understand a lot of how MVC works and a lot of the conventions behind MVC before you can start being proficient. So the things I'm talking about are, yeah, it's stateless, so you can't easily pass things from one form to another form. You need to sort of pass it via URL parameters or form post parameters, things like that. You've also got a lot more jQuery and JavaScript that you need to learn to be able to sort of have nice, I guess, user-friendly, rich web pages. But that's a great thing to learn, actually, learning jQuery. Raw HTML, you become very good at writing HTML. And if you have designers involved, you get very good at writing good HTML that designers can work with. And the conventions that I was talking about earlier, basically, yeah, you need to know about how the views work, how the models work, controllers. You've got display and editor templates so you can customize. So like when you render out a date field, do you want to just render out that as text? Do you want the time component? Do you want to have a nice date picker, or do you need to have a date and time picker? So you can control all of that as well. And to answer the question of like how long it'll take, generally just give it a couple of months for your developers to become proficient. I mean, if you're working with existing application. Again, just use that side-by-side model, get them to just do new functionality on MVC. And by a couple of months or a couple of sprints, they should become fairly comfortable with working with MVC. Once you do know these conventions, it's not that difficult. And the great thing about MVC as well is that there's heaps of video podcasts, heaps of blogs, heaps of tutorials and learning materials available for you to get skilled up on MVC. So the big question is, when I've got a new project, do I go with ASP.NET or MVC? For the business side of things, it's more of a time versus money equation. It does take longer to get upskilled in MVC, whereas ASP.NET have these nice server-side controls that you can just drag and drop, and you've got text boxes ready to go. There's good discussions on Stack Exchange, Stack Overflow on ASP.NET versus MVC, so I do recommend you check those out. But from a developer's perspective, it's all about the future and what's coming next. So I showed you those graphs. MVC is definitely on its way up. We'll see more and more projects on MVC. And yeah, it definitely does get you into the right space in terms of being able to write good testable applications. Okay, where do you want to learn more about MVC? Well, we've got ASP.NET MVC site itself. Scott Guthrie's got many good keynotes and presentations, so check out Channel 9. Our Damien Brady has a good MVC from Zero to Everywhere, MVC Mobile videocast that you can check out. And the offer that I want to make to you guys is that we've got this MVC course coming up that Damien and Adam Stevenson are doing. It's $330 plus GST. It's an on-site course, so it's going to be in Sydney and Brisbane. We might do a web version later down the track. There's the website. I'll go to that in a second. But if you do sign up for it, we've got Telerik is sponsoring the event, so you do get a free license for Kendo UI and their Just Code product. So you do get a good return on investment for attending these sessions. And we've also got an Enterprise Apps Part 2. So I'll just quickly jump into what's involved in one of these. So it's basically the problem that we've found with a lot of the presentations and blog posts that are on the internet is that they're more geared towards just demoing the technology and demoing all the great features about it, but it's not gearing you towards building maintainable enterprise level applications. So that's the goal of these courses, to have a look at what MVC4 offers and write from scratch a good enterprise web application that's maintainable, that just ticks all the right boxes for your organization. So take a quick look at the session agenda. So an intro to MVC, enterprise architecture, so what to look for, so getting familiar with dependency injection, being able to use factory patterns, things like that. So we do get quite technical on these. Working with data, so looking at the entity framework, code first, and also data migrations using entity framework. Looking at different enterprise patterns, scaffolding, looking at validation, and finally making it actually look pretty and usable. So definitely check out those two courses. Now it's Q&A time. I'll just go through some of the ones that are already here. So I've got a question on what about ASP.NET server controls? I'm not quite sure of the context of that, but ASP.NET, I'm guessing you're talking about like the grid views and things like that. So MVC doesn't have grid views and those sort of controls built in. You can use one of those third-party products like Telerik or Infragistics to give you a grid. But otherwise, it's not too difficult to write the grid yourself. You just render out a table with a header, and there's a lot of jQuery-based modules that let you add the sorting and paging. So in that respect, it's not too difficult. If you don't like writing out HTML, then check out one of those third-party products. Next question we've got here is, how does this fit in with the new WinRT on Windows 8? Well, what you can do is create a mobile view or a view targeted to Winate, so to render out a tile, because you can have tiles referencing a page. But in that respect, it's sort of more separate. What you normally do with MVC is build web applications, so or intranet portals. Next question we've got. Give an example of display and editor templates. Okay, I'll come back to that. Let me start up Visual Studio and I'll open up a project that we've worked on, and I'll come back to that and show you guys. We have custom server controls. Will they run in MVC? So I'm guessing you've got custom ASP.NET web forms controls. So no, they will not run in MVC, unfortunately. You'll need to find an equivalent or write your own sort of web controls. That being said, you can also just leave that page in ASP.NET Web Forms if you've got a lot of code base invested in that already, and just do your new pages in MVC. Let's see, next question we've got is, can you recommend any tools to use to monitor the performance of your client? Okay. I guess you're talking about load testing and performance testing in this case. So there are a lot of tools out there. You can use the Microsoft Test Manager and build up a web test and just use that to measure your performance. You can integrate that with your continuous deployments, which is great. So every time someone makes a change, you can then measure the performance on that. You can also use these cloud-hosted services as well. So like loadstorm.com is one where you just pay like a monthly subscription or like a one-time usage fee where you get a bucket of users and you can just hit your website with those users, and it gives you statistics like number of requests per second, number of errors, the throughput of your site. So we've used that in the past as well with some of our e-commerce websites that needed the performance. What kind of support for Azure or Amazon Web Services? So I think that's a pretty open-ended question, so I can take a stab at what that means. So in terms of Azure support, you can have MVC web applications deployed to Azure. You can have MVC web applications talk to Azure databases. So I'm not sure if that answers your question for Amazon Web Services. So if it doesn't, please ask another question and I'll try and follow that up. Next question we've got. More details on the MVC course. So check out the URL that I gave you. So r.ssw.com/MVC1. That's got a full course breakdown of what's going to be covered, and there's also a part 2 as well for that. Okay. Damien says YSlow is a great tool. Yeah, so you've got the browser add-ons as well. So for Firefox and Firebug, you can have YSlow browser extension to help you measure performance. So a quick show of that. Let me just open this. So if I just pop open the developer console, so this is in Chrome. Chrome's got this built-in page speed. You can have that analyze the client rendering performance, and it just gives you an overall score. So this one's 65 out of 100, which is pretty poor. But then it gives you tips on how to render those out, how to fix those. Actually, I should log in. This homepage is a bit of a dummy one. So I'll quickly show you. So yeah, in Firefox, you've got Firebug plus the YSlow extension. So we've got 84, which is a pretty decent one. So the typical recommendations they give you is to implement caching, use a CDN for your resources, combine your JavaScript, things like that. So minify JavaScript, all of that sort of stuff. Is there a way we can integrate reporting services with MVC? Yes, there is. So reporting services, I believe there's a reporting services control out there now that sort of works with MVC. I know it wasn't supported in the past, but I have to chase that up. The other way you can get around it is to use an iframe to your report services URL. Yeah, so I might have to chase that up for you. Okay, display and editor templates, I'm getting to that. Does the course include practical sections? Yes, the course will include a lab that you'll follow as well. So the lab, the courses will recommend you bring in a laptop. We'll provide an image for you, and you'll be doing labs when you do the different parts. Let's see. Any tips on adding MVC to existing legacy web forms apps? So yes, like I said, you can have MVC run side by side. You just need to make the call about new functionality, how integrated will you need to make it. You'll definitely need to do like a new master page and things like that, because it is sort of a separate instance of an app. There are great articles out there on how to do this as well. So definitely check that out. Is the course suitable for a classic ASP developer? Yes, it would be. Can you provide more info about the reporting services control, please? Nick, if you shoot me an email, I've got my details coming up. I can shoot you through some details on that reporting services control. Okay, so I think I've reached the end of most of your questions. So let me just open up a quick application to show the editor templates. Source control. Yep, so William, if you can shoot me an email, I'll just bring up my details as well so you can jot those down. So shoot me an email, I'll try and get back to you guys on that reporting services control, but let me try and get to this display and editor templates for now. Okay, so just while I'm loading up this solution to show you the templates, a quick call out as well. We've got SSW TV. I'm not sure if any of you have checked that out, but it's a nice website that we're trying to upload more and more developer-related videos to. So Damien's MVC one. These are some of the videos from DDD Brisbane. So we've got Look at Urban Turtle. Playing around with Fiddler, so for those of you who was asking about the monitoring client performance, definitely check out those videos. We've also got ones as well where we interview the Microsoft team, so this is actually an awesome one, how Scrum works at Microsoft. So check those out, put in some comments, give us feedback, where SSW TV is quite a new endeavour that we're, I guess, trying out, so we want to build up a community around these. So give some feedback. Where you did the page speed developer tool from Chrome. Okay, so Chrome, you probably need the developer build of Chrome or the beta, but you can find it by going Tools, Developer Tools, or Control-Shift-J is the shortcut. All right, I've got my solution loaded up now. So let me open it up. And I can quickly show you guys some of the templates. So the display and editor templates just allow MVC to control how certain data types get rendered out on the web page. So if I go to my web UI, oops, not content, views, shared. Okay, so we've got built-in templates. So if I pop open, say, oh sorry, these aren't the default ones, but I've customized some of these. So if I open up the time one, I can sort of control and configure how time gets rendered. Okay, so in this case, I take a date time and then I just strip out the date field and only show the time. I can have custom ones for like an employee category. So you can override the default ones as well. So if you've got a string field and you want to show a text area, and you've got a rich text control that you always like to use, you can swap that in and replace the default text area with that rich text control. Again, just check out the ASP.NET MVC website. There's lots of guides and tutorials on how to actually do these sort of things. But just a quick look at the solution as well. There's quite a number of files that actually get created when you do MVC. So definitely there's more files that you need to maintain and manage, but they're all based on conventions. Okay, so we've got a few more questions. Which one is better, link to SQL or link to entities regarding performance? Oh, okay. That one's a big kettle of fish. So with link to SQL and link to entities, there's pluses and minuses for both depending on certain scenarios. So generally, I would recommend sticking to link to entities where you can, because looking at all the development work that's happening, link to entities is definitely getting developed at a more rapid pace than link to SQL. So I know that there's a lot of websites out there that measure performance, and I think we've actually got rules on our website that go through some of the performance metrics for link to SQL versus link to entities. And I definitely know Julie Lerman has a blog post looking at the performance of link to entities versus link to SQL. So check that out as well. But if you want to shoot me an email, I can send you a link to those resources. How browser supportive is MVC3? Well, MVC3, well, it pretty much supports any browser out there. It also depends on what libraries and sort of things you're doing. So it uses jQuery. So jQuery by default is cross-browser. So Chrome, Firefox, IE, Safari, Opera. So they should all render out fine. But if they don't, if you find that things aren't rendering out okay in a particular browser, remember that you've got full control over the HTML, so you can actually customize it for certain browsers as well. So an example would be like that mobile targeting. So obviously, in this case, by default, it doesn't render out nicely with mobile, so you can actually create a mobile specific view for the smaller screen sizes. Okay. CSHTML, is that a custom extension? No, that's just the view engine that gets used. So CSHTML is the, or in this case, I'm using Razor for my project. I'll bring it up again and quickly show you. So it's where I basically code most of my HTML and play around with the model. So I'll quickly show you one of the views that I've got. So if I go to timesheet index, let's try and make that as big as possible. Yeah, so I've got bits here where I've got a div to show different things. I'm using a Telerik grid to render out a grid, performance, things like that. I've got a scripting section down here, so hopefully that answers your questions. It's built into MVC. What's my opinion on NHibernate? NHibernate's a great ORM. Yeah, if you like NHibernate, use NHibernate. It's definitely well supported. It's very mature. Link to entities works fine as well. It's just really up to your preference. If you're more familiar with NHibernate, use NHibernate. If you're more familiar with Entity Framework, use Entity Framework. All right, great. It looks like I've reached the end of most of your questions. So again, my details are over here. So if you've got questions, feel free to shoot me a question. Basically, thanks for listening in on this webinar. I look forward to running another webinar in the future. So take care, guys. Thanks for tuning in. And hopefully I'll see some of you send through some questions on email. Thanks for watching, guys. We've got lots more content on tv.ssw.com, so be sure to subscribe. Thanks.